When the fighting in Europe finally ceased in May 1945, the silence didn't mean immediate order. Scattered along back roads, destroyed industrial zones, and quiet rural fields, thousands of German armored giants remained exactly where they fell during the final months of the conflict. Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, and assault guns hadn't vanished with the surrender. They remained motionless, burned out, incomplete, or simply abandoned by crews who had run out of fuel or spare parts. At the moment of the German capitulation, on May 8, 1945, the Reich's armored power was already deeply compromised. Constant bombing raids had shattered production chains across the continent. Factories operated sporadically, and a crippling fuel shortage made mobility nearly impossible for the once mighty panzer divisions. During the retreats of the final months, many units were forced to abandon perfectly intact vehicles simply for lack of diesel or lubricating oil. In other cases, the crews themselves sabotaged engines and transmissions to prevent capture in operational condition by the advancing Allies. Regions like the Ruhr, Bavaria, and the outskirts of Berlin became vast, involuntary concentration areas for these tanks. Allied troops found them parked in railway yards, makeshift workshops, and forest clearings. Many had been partially dismantled radios, optical sights, or engine components removed to keep other vehicles running for just a few more days. Others existed only as metallic husks, stripped of essential systems, and left to rust in the wake of the war. Shortly after the occupation, Allied forces began to isolate and record these vehicles. In the sector controlled by the United States, technical intelligence teams began a massive cataloging effort that spanned months. British officers, through REME units, Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, conducted similar surveys to assess the mechanical condition of the German fleet. In the east, specialized Soviet trophy brigades collected tanks and parts from Silesia all the way to the heart of Berlin. The condition of the vehicles varied significantly from site to site. Some Panthers and Panzer IVs appeared functional at first glance, but hid severe internal wear in gears, axles, and transmission systems from overextended use. Others were hollowed-out husks, missing valuable components. There were also incomplete prototypes and newly produced chassis that had never received armament, engines, or optical systems, a direct reflection of the German industrial collapse in the final months of the war. During these inspections, Allied teams discovered technical records, production orders, and operational reports in workshops and depots. Although many documents had been deliberately burned or destroyed, the remaining material allowed them to reconstruct part of the operational history of these blindados. Still, until the summer of 1945, most of the surviving fleet sat in yards under Allied control, awaiting political and military decisions about their eventual fate. With the definition of occupation zones, the focus shifted from mere retrieval to comprehension. The United States and the United Kingdom demonstrated a strong interest in evaluating German engineering. The goal wasn't to reuse these tanks in combat, but to understand why they had been so effective in certain scenarios and, at the same time, so problematic logistically. In the American case, this effort focused on the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Starting in late 1945, various German vehicles were shipped across the Atlantic, including Panthers, Tiger Is, Tiger IIs, Jag Tigers, and assault guns. These tanks underwent extensive tests, armor resistance, firing trials, and mechanical performance. The results were startlingly consistent: exceptional firepower and superior optics, but recurring failures in the transmission and final drive systems that would have made long-term use difficult. The British conducted similar evaluations, mostly on German soil within their occupation zone. Engineers directly compared the Panther with Allied models like the Sherman and the Churchill. The sloped armor and long-range gun caught their attention, as did the precision of the optical systems. However, British reports emphasized the excessive complexity of these vehicles, highlighting the time and resources required for maintenance in real field conditions, which were often lacking for the German crews. The Soviet approach followed a different path. Instead of focusing on engineering for their own development, the Soviets collected large quantities of Panzer IVs, Panthers, and Stugs for practical training and testing. The results confirmed observations made during the war: excellent frontal protection and high-velocity guns, but mechanical systems that deteriorated rapidly under intense use. Over the years, the lack of spare parts led to the systematic scrapping of these captured tanks as newer Soviet models arrived. German research centers also revealed projects that never reached combat. In centers like Kummersdorf and Hillesleben, Allied forces found incomplete chassis, experimental vehicles, and components linked to programs like the Super Heavy Mouse and the E-Series. In Haustenbeck, workshops contained damaged Jag Tigers, Panthers under maintenance, and vast stocks of spare parts, clear evidence of desperate attempts to keep an armored force operational until the very final days. Initial occupation directives mandated that all German armored vehicles be declared and protected from unauthorized reuse. This quickly led to debates among the Allies. Should they keep these tanks for prolonged study, transfer them to Allied nations, or destroy them to eliminate any risk of future rearmament? Each power followed its own path. The Americans prioritized technical testing. The Soviets accumulated large stockpiles before deciding their fate, while the British, limited by resources, evaluated only a small number of specimens. Despite the different approaches, final reports showed a pattern. German engineering produced tanks with excellent ballistic performance and advanced optics, but at the cost of excessive complexity and mechanical unreliability. These findings directly influenced early tank development during the Cold War, reinforcing the importance of sloped armor and good sighting systems, but also the critical need for operational simplicity in the field. Even after the tests concluded, the Allies still controlled immense quantities of steel. Between 1946 and 1948, the Allied Control Council issued clear orders for the systematic destruction of all prohibited German military equipment. Armored vehicles were classified as material that could not remain on German soil under any circumstances to prevent any resurgence of militarism. This process sparked a large-scale demilitarization campaign across the country. Industrial regions like the Ruhr became dismantling hubs. Steel mills in cities like Bochum and Magdeburg received long lines of armored hulls transported by rail. Workers used blowtorches and heavy presses to cut Panthers, Panzer IVs, and Stugs into smaller sections for melting. The post-war steel shortage meant this recycled material was quickly incorporated into the reconstruction of bridges, factories, and housing projects that were desperately needed. Not all German tanks went directly to recycling plants. In various regions of Central Europe, Allied engineers employed abandoned tanks in civil engineering and environmental control. In rural areas, damaged vehicles were pushed into unstable slopes, riverbeds, and erosion-prone terrain to serve as anchors. One widely documented case occurred along the Ems River, where Panthers were incorporated into makeshift dikes to reinforce riverbanks. Over the years, these vehicles were covered by soil and vegetation, becoming virtually invisible to the naked eye. Similar practices occurred in quarries and mining areas, where hulls served as fill material to stabilize ground prone to landslides. In many of these locations, the tanks remained buried for decades, discovered only occasionally during later civil works or archaeological surveys. This pragmatic use reflected the immediate need to remove metal without overloading the limited industrial infrastructure of the post-war years. Another significant portion of German tanks was destined for firing ranges and training grounds. The British used captured vehicles in areas like Lulworth, while American and Soviet forces employed them at various training sites at home and abroad. These vehicles allowed for the evaluation of new types of ammunition and anti-tank combat techniques in a controlled and realistic environment. After being repeatedly hit, the tanks used as targets became structurally unviable for any other use. Some remained on the ranges as visual references for training, while others were eventually dismantled and sent for recycling once their purpose was served. Cleanup operations continued for several years in regions that had seen intense combat. In Czechoslovakia and Poland, local teams removed destroyed vehicles from roads, forests, and old defensive lines. Many were partially buried, requiring considerable effort to extract. After removal, they were sent to scrap yards or reused in local engineering projects. Old research centers were also dismantled. Components linked to the Maus program, E-Series experimental chassis, and incomplete test vehicles were cut up and eliminated. The volume of this destruction was so vast that very few intact specimens remained outside those reserved for museums. Rumors of secret depots filled with intact Panthers or Tigers surfaced occasionally in the following decades, but investigations pointed to misunderstandings or Cold War rumors. Despite the mass destruction, some German tanks found a second life outside Germany in surprising locations. France was a primary example of this reuse. French units integrated Panthers stored in southwest Germany into combat regiments after the war. Crews recognized the superiority of the gun and optics compared to many Allied tanks of the time. However, mechanical problems surfaced early, just as the Allies had predicted during their tests. With few parts available, French workshops began dismantling damaged vehicles to keep others running in the field. In 1951, the last French Panthers were retired from service due to high maintenance costs and the arrival of newer equipment. The French experience was not unique. Czechoslovakia continued to produce the Hetzer, designated locally as the G13, for export to Switzerland, where they served for many years. Its relatively simple mechanics and reliable engines made the Hetzer attractive for economical defense solutions in the post-war era. Additionally, Czechoslovakia itself used remaining Panzer IVs and Stugs until replacing them with Soviet armor. As standardization became a priority for the Eastern Bloc. Other countries like Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia incorporated Panzer IVs and assault guns obtained through capture or Allied redistribution, using them for training until T-34s became available in larger numbers. Spain followed a different path. In 1943, Germany provided Franco's government with a small batch of Panzer IVs and Stugs. These remained Spain's primary tanks until the mid-1950s, operating alongside older models. As maintenance difficulties grew, the number of operational vehicles dwindled. In 1967, Spain sold 17 surviving Panzer IVs to Syria, where they would see their final combat. Syria became one of the most unexpected users of post-war German tanks. During the 1950s and 60s, the country acquired Panzer IVs from both Czechoslovakia and Spain. These veterans were positioned in frontline units near the Golan Heights. Surprisingly, they remained in service until the 1970s, representing one of the last known operational uses of German World War II tanks. In active combat, a bizarre echo of the World War during the height of the Cold War. The survival of these vehicles was linked to incredible improvisation by Syrian mechanics who manufactured their own parts. While their overall impact was limited, these tanks influenced early Cold War military doctrine in countries seeking quick solutions for territorial defense. As the 1950s progressed, most users retired their German tanks as major powers provided standardized equipment. Remaining specimens were redirected to museums, memorials, or technical collections for preservation. Institutions like the Tank Museum at Bovington, the Saumur Tank Museum, and the Kubinka Tank Museum preserved Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs as physical records of an era that had been almost entirely dismantled. They stand today as reminders of the engineering and the immense scale of the conflict. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive and want to help our project here on YouTube, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Which German tank do you think was the most iconic?